A.J. Brown, wide receiver of the Tennessee Titans, is one of my favorite buy low players in fantasy football heading into week 6 of the NFL season. Now, I have a lot of projections, stats, data, and ultimately a conclusion I want to get to at the end. But before I get into all of that, let's just take a look at these first 5 weeks for A.J. Brown so far, what has got us to this point, and let's get a little bit of context in our brains before we dive into all the stats and everything else. So week 1 versus the Cardinals, I'm going to go by half PPR points as well. I know most people play in PPR or standard, but I don't want to have to reference both, so I'm just going to meet in the middle. He has 8 targets for 4 receptions, 49 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Ultimately puts up 12.9 half PPR points. Now, the Titans struggled in that game. Obviously, they were getting sacked left and right. But A.J. Brown, even though he didn't boom, didn't necessarily bust in this game either. It was a fine performance for A.J. Brown to start off the year. Week 2 versus the Seahawks, however, wasn't. It was a dud. He had 9 targets. The team threw the ball 40 times in that game, so he had nearly a 25% target share in a very pass-heavy script. However, the efficiency just wasn't there. Only 3 receptions for 43 yards. That's just not going to get the job done. Led to 5.8 half PPR points. Week 3 versus the Colts, only 0.3 half PPR points. He leaves in the first quarter with that hamstring injury. That hamstring injury also caused him to miss week 4 against the Jets. And then week 5 versus the Jaguars, last week obviously, 6 targets for 3 receptions, 38 receiving yards. That's 5.3 half PPR points. So that was another disappointing week for A.J. Brown. And fantasy owners are really starting to get flustered. And this is a point where his value is low. But last week against the Jaguars, let's take some context into mind. They only threw the ball 22 times because Derrick Henry was just running all over them, and the Jaguars offense didn't put up enough points against this poor Titans defense to force the Titans into a pass-heavy script. And I know some people are going to be concerned about that, but I'll get to the Titans don't throw the ball enough thing in a little bit, because that's a total myth. I also think his injury still played a factor in this game. He only played 64% of snaps. The Titans had him on a pitch count in this game. It tells you that injury was still limiting him, and obviously it's his first game back in basically 2 weeks, so there's going to be a little bit of rust involved as well. Now, there is this, again, whole myth that A.J. Brown's just not getting enough targets, they're not going to throw the ball enough. It just isn't true. First of all, for his targets, he's averaging 6.25 targets per game this year, which would put him on pace for 100 if he plays the rest of the season. But that's including the Colts game, where he only had 2 targets because he left in the first quarter. So let's subtract that Colts game. Let's act like he missed that game entirely, because he basically did. So that's subtracting his 2 targets as well, but the whole game entirely. That puts him at 7.66 targets per game so far this season, which puts him on pace for 115 targets if he plays the rest of the year. So 7.66 targets per game, that's about the same number he had last year. So targets so far, not really the issue. And it's not that the Titans aren't throwing the ball either. Last season, Ryan Tannehill threw 30.1 passing attempts per game. This season, he's throwing 34.6 passing attempts per game. So their passing numbers have actually spiked. And I know last week was a run-heavy script against the Jaguars, but that game was more of an anomaly than anything. This Titans team is going to be throwing the ball 30-plus times per game on average. So far this season, they've seen a 4.5 passing attempt uptick in Ryan Tannehill's numbers. So yeah, the targets are there. They're going to be throwing the football, and they have so far this year outside of that one Jacksonville game. But still, people want to act like their run-heavy attack is the reason, and he's just not getting enough volume. Some people want to say that, not everybody, but let's take a look at that. Because they have been run-heavy. Don't get it mistaken. The Titans are second in attempts so far this season, only behind the Browns. They're at 172 rushing attempts this year, the Tennessee Titans are. I have some bad news for the people that think the running game is an issue, but I also have plenty of good news. So the bad news is, yes, the Titans have been run heavy. They're going to be run heavy, but there is some good news. First of all, the run game, they were run heavy last year, and A.J. Brown still had a fantastic season. They've been run heavy this year, and the volume is still there. They're still throwing the ball nearly 35 times per game. So luckily, even with this run-heavy attack, it doesn't affect the pass game. There's still plenty of volume in the passing game for A.J. Brown. And And I also have a little bit more good news. Now, Derrick Henry this season has 142 rushing attempts. The next highest is Alvin Kamara at 94. So Derrick Henry has 48 more rushing attempts than anybody in the league so far this season. That puts him at 28.4 carries per game, which would put him on pace in a 17-game season for 483 rushing attempts. The NFL record is held by Larry Johnson at 416. So 483 rushing attempts. Listen, Derrick Henry is the best running back in football. He's an all-time talent. He's an absolute bell cow, a workhorse. He might eclipse 400 rushing attempts this season. He might even break the record and maybe touch the 420s, 430s even. I think that would be astonishing. But there's no doubt about it. His volume's going to see at least a slight decrease by a carry or two per game at very, very least, because there's no way he finished this season with 483 rushing attempts. It's not sustainable. So you have nothing to worry about, because even with this run-heavy attack, the Titans still have plenty of targets and passing attempts to go around. But the run-heavy attack will start to, diminish just a little bit as the season goes on. But they will still remain run-heavy. But with that being said, as we can see here, they're still throwing the ball. A.J. Brown's still getting plenty of targets. And I know people want to say, listen, Julio Jones only played that first week. If I'm not mistaken, he's missed most of the season. This is true, and he's going to take some targets from A.J. Brown, but I still think there's going to be plenty on the table for Brown when Julio Jones gets back. Because look at this passing offense, nearly 35 attempts per game. They're going to be hovering between 35 and 30, per game on average. And their targets are who? Julio Jones and A.J. Brown. And sure, Derrick Henry now catches a few passes, and Josh Reynolds should start getting involved a little bit, and you're going to have your Chester Rogers getting in a little bit. But for the most part, it's really just A.J. Brown and Julio Jones. And we all talked about over the offseason how much this actually could help A.J. Brown. I know last year he still had a great year as the lone receiver, but now instead of just Derrick Henry acting as the only quote-unquote distraction, because outside of Derrick Henry, the defense is really just worried about A.J. Brown, but now defenses have to worry about Derrick Henry and Julio Jones, along with A.J. Brown, obviously. So that's going to open things up a little bit more, and it, could take some targets away, but there's still going to be plenty of targets for A.J. Brown to get, and this just takes some pressure off of him. So I'm actually not fazed by the Julio thing as much as some other people are. Now, people want to say that the issue is on Ryan Tannehill and the offensive line, because the offensive line isn't giving them enough time to develop this, passing, downfield passing offense. Now, if you look at the sack numbers, you think this is absolutely true. In 2020, the Titans allowed the 7th fewest sacks in the league at 25, and so far this season, they've allowed the most at 20. So last season, they allowed 25 sacks in 16 games. They've already allowed 20 this year, which is the worst in the NFL. Now, sacks hurt, okay? And this team has allowed a lot more sacks, and, those can stop some drives and all these things. It's definitely a stat to keep an eye on. But I like to dive a little deeper, because I don't think the amount of sacks allowed is a correct reflection on how the offensive line's played and what's truly going on there. Because if we look at it in 2020, let's dive a little deeper to some more accurate stats. In 2020, the Titans allowed a 23.2% pressure rate and gave Ryan Tannehill 2.5 seconds in the pocket. In 2021, their pressure rate has actually gone down to 21.8%, and his time in the pocket is 2.3 seconds. These numbers are almost identical. So in terms of pressure and time to throw in the pocket, the numbers are nearly identical from last year. And I know the sack numbers are bigger, and that's going to scare some people, but if you really dive into it, in terms of pressure and time in the pocket, the numbers are basically identical, so that's not the issue either. Now, I do think part of the issue slightly is the loss of Arthur Smith. That's going to play a factor a little bit, but the play calling has not been bad so far this season. I just think it's going to take a little bit of time to click. The issue so far this season, the moment you've all been waiting for, it's the efficiency. In 2019, A.J. Brown's rookie season, he had 84 targets, capitalized with 52 receptions, had a 62% catch rate. In 2020, which was last season, he spiked up to 106 targets, but caught 70 of them, so his catch rate actually improved to 66%. This year, he has 25 targets and only 10 receptions, which is a 40% catch rate. So people are going to be alarmed by that. They're going to say rookie season was 62%, last year was 66%. This year you're dropping by 26% from last year to 40%. You get in panic mode, but don't panic. Don't panic at all. This is a small sample size, and you're completely mistaken if you think this is anywhere sustainable, that he's going to stay around 40%. Like, this has nowhere to go but up. The only players to finish with under a 50% catch rate in 2020, minimum 100 targets, was Jerry Jeudy and AJ Green. Jerry Jeudy had 113 targets and a 46% catch rate. But let's also keep in mind Jerry Jeudy was towards the top of the league in drops that year, and he also had Drew Lock as his quarterback. And AJ Green had 104 targets last year with a 45% catch rate. Let's also keep in mind that AJ Green had no business getting 100 targets last year, at least in my opinion. He was hardly gaining any separation. It was a bit of a headache. He looked washed last year, to be completely honest with you, and I hate to say that about AJ Green, because I still think he's a good football player. But the 40%, I mean, even between those guys, Jerry Jeudy and AJ Green, who were outliers last year when the season was all said and done, they're at 45 and 46%. AJ Brown right now is at 40. That just goes to show you there's nowhere to go but up. And for some of those of you who want to say, well, yeah, it's like the small game sample size, maybe other people are also having these same struggles. Not really. I mean, there are definitely a few more under 50% than there will be by the end of the year, but the only players to finish with under 50% catch rate in 2021 so far this year, minimum 20 targets, outside of A.J. Brown, is DJ Chark and Elijah Moore. DJ Chark with 22 targets, a 32% catch rate. Elijah Moore at 20 targets with a 40% catch rate. And, you know, as you can imagine what I'm going to say, I think this especially rings true with Elijah Moore. Like, Zach Wilson hasn't exactly dimed him up. There have been plenty of times where Elijah Moore's open and Zach Wilson just throws it at his feet or way over his head. And Trevor Lawrence hasn't been to that extreme, but, you know, he's still figuring things out as well. And DJ Chark obviously is done for the year, so he only played a couple games. A.J. Brown has nowhere to go but up. And there were some players, you know, if you get into the 50%, like DJ Moore was at 56% last year. Marquise Brown was in the 50s as well. But for the most part, out of like the 42 guys who had over 100 targets last year, a large majority finished with over 60% catch rate. Right now, A.J. Brown's is at 40%, and there is nowhere to go but up. He might finish in the high 50s. Like, he might have a down year. I think, honestly, A.J. Brown will have a bit of a regression. He will suffer a bit from regression this season. He had 11 touchdowns last year and a 66% catch rate on over, 100 targets. I don't see him reaching 11 touchdowns again this year. And I don't see him reaching a 66% catch rate. But at very worst, at bare minimum, he's going to have around a 56% catch rate this year. And that's at worst, in my opinion. A 56% catch rate is still a 16% spike from what he's at right now. And when you combine the fact that, 56% isn't great, it's not ideal, but he's still going to score touchdowns. In my opinion, he only has one so far to start this year. But in his rookie year, he put up 8 touchdowns. Last season, he put up 11. I think he's going to finish at bare minimum with 6 this year, but most likely around 7. Bare minimum 6, 7, around 6 or 7 is what I'm really trying to say. And there's a chance he might finish with 8, maybe even 9 if he gets pretty hot. I do see that number going down. Touchdowns are in a sticky stat, but A.J. Brown is a big play machine. He's a threat in the red zone, and the dude scores touchdowns. So he's going to finish at, again, bare minimum 6, maybe even 7 or 8, could push 9. Keep in mind he's only scored 1 touchdown so far, so that means he's going to score at least 5, 6, 7, 8 touchdowns over the next 12 games. And I think it's more going to be around 5, 6, 7. But that's still not bad. That's, you're averaging almost 1 touchdown every 2 games. That you got to be pretty happy about that. So A.J. Brown might regress a little bit from last season. We have to just accept that. But last season, he set the bar extremely high. There's nowhere to go but up from here in terms of A.J. Brown's efficiency. And that's really the only issue, because the targets are there. The talent is absolutely there. We just need to get the efficiency back on track. And right now, it just hasn't been there on a very, very small sample size. Very, very small. That's all I really got to say. I think A.J. Brown is one of my favorite buy low targets. And a lot of people want to say, how can A.J. Brown be buy low? he's too big of a name. You're still going to have to give up somebody notable for him. Yes, but the point of buy low is it's when a guy is at any player. You can be a star player. It can be a waiver wire level guy. A guy, though, he's at one of his lowest points in terms of stock on the year. And we're suggesting you buy him while he's low because you're going to be able to give up less than what you're actually going to get for that player. And right now, I think in most leagues, you're going to be able to give up. You're going to be able to get more for A.J. Brown than you're going to end up giving up. There's going to be positive net value there because a lot of people who own A.J. Brown are fed up right now and they're impatient because their team is probably losing. And it makes sense. A lot of A.J. Brown owners are on the 0-5 and the 1-4 team so far this year. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Because obviously when you pick a second or third round pick and he is struggling and out for games, it's definitely going to hurt your team. But A.J. Brown, again, I know there are some causes for concern, but the efficiency has nowhere to go but up, and the targets are still there for him. The talent is still there. I really, really like him as one of my, if not my favorite, buy low option in fantasy football heading into week 6. But that's all I got to say. Make sure you go subscribe to the TWSN YouTube channel. The button is right down below. We have live shows daily. We have content just like this coming out all the time. We've also got an Instagram and a Twitter where we break news daily. We even have our graphics design team does an out-of-this-world job with our graphics, and it's amazing stuff. I can assure you don't want to miss out. They do a kick-ass job, and I'm going to leave the links to those in the description. But other than that, I really have nothing else to say, so I'll see you guys later.